Hello and welcome to the Best Practices Summit. Pollinator Friendly Alliance is a grassroots 501c3 nonprofit that protects the natural world through the conservation of pollinators. Our co-host is the Xerces Society, a science-based nonprofit.
I'm Sarah Foltz. I'm a pollinator conservation biologist with Cerseis. I'm based in Duluth, Minnesota, working across the Great Lakes region primarily. I have just a few intro slides on Xerces. I know many of you are pretty familiar with our organization. We are an international nonprofit focused on the protection of invertebrates and their habitats. We take our name from this butterfly here, the Xerces blue, which was the first butterfly to go extinct in North America on account of human land use changes. We have a staff of about 70 people now. We were really excited to celebrate our 50th anniversary just a few months ago. And yeah, we work in quite a few different program areas, ranging from pollinators to pesticides, endangered species, do a lot of education and outreach. Here in the Midwest, we're largely focused on rewilding our agricultural landscapes in particular for biodiversity conservation. And we're also just doing a lot of trying to build knowledge and enthusiasm about insects and native plants and restoration practices, which is really a lot of what this summit is going to cover. So I have just a couple of background slides before I jump into the fun part, the insects themselves. But I wanted to pose this question. So why are insects so important to the well-being of our planet? And I don't think we can actually answer that, but a few key points that might help us understand that are their diversity. So they're astoundingly diverse, nearly 1 million described species, making up over 50% of all described organism species, and roughly 75% of all animals. So very diverse, also very abundant, and have considerable biomass. Arthropods make up in our terrestrial systems, roughly 2/5 of the animal biomass. They're also very ancient. They have a long history of life on our planet. Their fossil record stretches back over 400 million years with many, many radiation events, including a radiation event that corresponded with that of flowering plants, and before that, with that of fungi. So all of this diversity in form, in function, and behavior, coupled with really astounding abundance and biomass, has not surprisingly led to many, many complex, highly evolved, sophisticated interactions between other organisms and insects. And yeah, I mean, we cannot even begin to understand, I don't think, the complexity of what's really going on in our natural world. But I hope that this talk gives you maybe just a little taste of some of what these insects are doing. Lori touched on this a little bit, so I can run through it pretty briefly, but insects play a lot of roles in our ecosystem function, ranging from nutrient recycling, so degrading and consuming plant and animal material, leaf litter, wood, carrion, dung, as you can see with this dung beetle, dispersing fungi. They play an enormous role in our food chains, providing meals for all kinds of higher, I don't even want to say higher trophic levels, but all kinds of other insects and small mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, fish. They play a major role in maintaining community structure and composition. They're agents of disease, predation, parasitism, herbivory, and plant propagation through pollination and also through seed dispersal. Okay, but more than any of that, what I really want you to take away from this talk is the fact that insects are a lot like us. They are parents, siblings, homemakers, lovers, farmers, community members, innovators, communicators. They are like us. They are resourceful, insightful. Oops, sorry, guys. I can't actually see all the text on my slide because there's something blocking it, but I think that says fearful, manipulative, strategic, prone to copy their peers. They have dietary restrictions. Really, we could go on and on. And maybe it sounds like I'm going overboard with humanizing them, but I really think that as we continue to energize more people to act on behalf of insects, what I was saying about their ecological roles and functions isn't going to resonate with a lot of people. But I think and hope that these types of similarities matter. The stories and struggles of insects can help us recognize their inherent value, regardless of their relationship to us. So insects can be incredibly beneficial to us. For example, with pollination services, or they can be incredibly problematic and devastating to our crops, spreading disease. For this talk, I think we can just put all of that aside. At Xerces, we talk a lot about beneficial insects and what they do for us, but all of that aside, these are just amazing animals that I hope we can relate to. A little background on insect diet. Most of our insects are herbivores, so feeding on all types of plant tissues, leaves, seeds, roots, and that includes our pollinators, feeding on the pollen and nectar of flowers. Many of our insects are predators, and most of them are fairly generalist, so they can consume a range of prey. In contrast, the herbivores tend to have specialization on particular plant chemistries. Many of our insects are parasites and parasitoids. You'll be hearing a lot about them from Heather on tomorrow. Some of our insects are fungivores. I'm going to talk about a few of them, and then we have many decomposers. Diet of insect often changes with life stage. You can have the larval stage feeding on something very different from the adults. Larvae are typically heavy feeders. They're doing a lot of the growing. Adults may or may not feed. Pupae generally don't feed, although everything I say today, there's probably an exception for. So keep that in mind. That's just how big this group is. Oh, this photo on the left is showing a neat example of two insects in the same family. They're both stink bugs with very different diets. So the one on the left is a plant feeder, like most of our stink bugs. The one on the right is a predatory stink bug feeding on this plant feeding stink bug. So even within a small group, you can have pretty varied diet. Okay, so the rest of my talk is just meandering through. I wanted it to feel like wandering through some wild space, stopping here and there, seeing what we see. So I'll walk you through quite a few different insect taxa. My only criteria in selecting these insects were not a bee or a butterfly, because they get a lot of attention. I've given them a lot of attention at this summit in past years. Also, Heather and I are going to be giving a talk on Thursday morning, where we'll cover quite a bit about bees and Lepidoptera. I didn't want to cover wasps because Heather is doing that. I wanted to cover insects that I encounter, so things that are common enough in the upper Midwest that I think you'll be seeing them too. And for those of you not in the upper Midwest, these groups are pretty big and diverse, and you've likely got this species or something like it in your neck of the woods as well. I also wanted insects with interesting stories. That didn't help me narrow it down at all. Every single insect has a story. Even I'm going to talk about some kind of common things like aphids and grasshoppers, which you can go deeper and deeper and deeper and still find more to marvel at. Okay, so I'm starting with leaf miners. I did structure this a little bit in terms of diet. So I'm starting with some herbivores, appreciated groups of insects that I could think of. They spend their lives within, at least part of their lives, within the tissue of leaves, sometimes stems. There's over 2,000 species in this group. It's a everything in the group is not closely related. So there are many orders that have evolved this strategy independently, including moths, flies, beetles, and sawflies in that order of relative abundance. So over 1,000 moths in North America, hundreds of flies and beetles, dozens of sawflies. They feed within the tissue of plants. They form these visible mines or tunnels, like you can see on the right. They have a high degree of host specificity, so they typically feed on or are restricted to just a few plant genera. You can see this fly on the bottom. This I don't think it has a common name, but it feeds exclusively on plants in the Commandra, like bastard toadflax and others in that family. And this is the damage on the leaf. So you might not even notice that. But the patterns can be diagnostic for people who know what they're looking for. And I'll show you on this next slide something that will probably look familiar. This is one that I see very commonly. The columbine leaf miner. I don't see the fly often. I've never seen the fly, but I see this I'm not even going to call it damage. I see this evidence of the larval activity on leaves. So I'm guessing you probably do too. Eggs are laid on the foliage around the time of flowering. The larvae tunnel into the leaf. So they're going right between the two layers of the leaf. They pupate on the underside of the leaf, which you can see in this photo on the right, or sorry, in the middle. The pupae are pretty conspicuous in this species. They're bright red. If you think to turn over the leaf, you might see them. They have several successive generations per year. These photos were taken by our friend MJ Hatfield in Iowa, who's just a very keen observer of the natural world, and does a lot of rearing of some of these obscure insects. And so this photo, the two photos of the leaves were taken in June, just to give you a sense of kind of their life cycle. So she found evidence of the larval feeding and the pupae. She reared these pupae and a couple of months later had adults emerging. The tunnels are conspicuous, but cause very little damage to plants. This little quote here is from a Midwest extension office. And what they said was, the leaf miner is not fatal to the plant, but may be aesthetically displeasing. And I'm calling that out here because I think that's probably a really common sentiment, but not necessarily the right one. I really would encourage us to try to learn to see plant herbivory not so much as damage, like I said before, but rather as something beautiful and as evidence of success. So our plantings are working. Our plants are being fed on. People want to know what kind of insecticide to use to control this type of I'll say damage again. That book I just showed you here has 100 pages on the parasitoids and predators of leaf miner flies. So very likely that nature will take care of herself, and insecticides would do more harm than good by eliminating natural enemies and damaging a native insect that's really not doing anything wrong. Okay, next group are the blister beetles. Adults are primarily herbivorous on the amaranth family, asters, Fabaceae and Solanaceae. The larvae are predaceous. In apocata, one genus, they are restricted to grasshopper eggs, and in a few other genera, they feed on immature bees and the pollen stores of bees. The first instar of the larva is highly mobile. You can see this photo on the upper right. They have nice long legs for crawling and also for grasping. These ones hang out on flowers where they wait for a bee to fly by, and they grab onto that bee with those legs and hitchhike back to the bee's nest, where they can then have access to the bee larvae and pollen stores. They are also interesting in this toxin that they emit and have within their bodies. It's also how they get their name. So it's a blistering agent to humans. It protects these insects from predators, so it's very distasteful to some things that eat them. And it's also interestingly used by other animals. The main example is pyracroid beetles. So they're a smaller beetle. The males will seek out these blister beetles and crawl all over them, agitate them, and get them to secrete this toxin. They then gather it. So they actually lick it up. They use it to attract a female. They incorporate it into a sperm package, which they give to a female. And then she uses it to coat and protect her eggs from being eaten before they hatch. There's also some pretty interesting history of use by humans that I don't know if I'll go into, nor do I recommend or endorse any of that. But yeah, interesting beetle. Here on the right, you can see, so this is just a closer look at the apocata genus. These are the ones that feed on the grasshopper eggs. You can see that a mating pair here on, this was on a lupin plant. It pretty much defoliated. And yeah, what do I want to point out here? I mean, they're really, they hang out right in the open. You can kind of tell that they're probably distasteful because of that behavior, not hiding at all. I can tell the male is on the bottom because the males often have these modified antennae, these kinks in the antennae that they use to hold the female antennae during mating. They're not doing it right there, but sometimes that happens. This diagram on the left is for those of you who want to know more about how that triangulin, that highly active first instar larva, fits into the rest of the life cycle. That's a pretty unusual thing in beetles to have this stage. And really that stage is active in getting to the food source that they need, the grasshopper eggs or the bee larvae, and then they hunker down and begin to look and act more like a typical beetle grub in the soil. Okay, so another group, the treehoppers, Membracidae. Oh, these are just beautiful insects. They have an enlarged pronotum. It's kind of like a big helmet that covers their abdomen and head, often with really interesting protrusions, which sometimes help them blend in with their environment. Some of them look very thorny. They typically feed on trees and shrubs, but some of them feed on herbaceous plants. They're incredible at jumping. Those of you who have seen them can relate to the fact that you kind of go near them and they disappear and they jump so fast. They typically have ant-tending mutualism, and I'm guessing many of you are really familiar with that, but for those of you who aren't, with ant tending, you have a situation where ants care for the bugs and protect them. They hang out right around the bugs and their younger nymphal stages, and they protect them from predators. So if parasitoids or predators come near, the ants get really aggressive. And in exchange, the bugs are feeding on plant sap and then excreting a honeydew, which the ants are gathering for their own food. So it's a lot like the way we care for dairy cows. Yeah, and it's pretty common in the Homoptera. So like the aphids, I'll talk about a little bit later, and this group here just as examples. Like I said, many of these insects are stunning. Many of them have highly specific plant feeding preferences. This wide-footed treehopper on the right feeds, especially on goldenrods. I guess there are some other plants that'll feed on as well. This one in the middle feeds on oaks primarily. Oh yeah, I also wanted to point out that the nymphs are more vulnerable and less protected than the adults. This shield gets bigger. So an example of an organism getting more hard and crusty with age. Here we're just showing how ornate they are. Oh, I mean, this is just incredible. Some of them look, at least to me, these ones, I don't know if you all can see my mouse, but these ones look a lot like ants facing the wrong direction, which probably helps the insect when it's escaping a predator. The most ornate one that I've seen here is this keeled treehopper. It's kind of dull and drab, but it has this really nice cutout, and it's exclusive to the Aster family. I find it almost every year on native thistles. This is the underside of a field thistle leaf. The eggs are laid right on the leaves, on young, tender leaves. This picture in the middle, you can kind of see how the adults blend in a little bit with the thistle spines. And mothers exhibit parental care. They spend a great deal of time protecting their egg masses, protecting their young. They're also tended by ants. So you can see this ant here in the middle of the photo on the right, waving its antennae around, maybe getting some honeydew. I'm disappointed in the quality of these photos, but I also remember ants crawling all over me when I was up in there with my camera. So yeah, mothers giving care for their offspring, but also needing some help. That sounds familiar to me. Okay, moving to another group now. This is the aphids. Really familiar group, probably one of the most disliked insects out there, up there with mosquitoes probably. But they're fascinating, they're sophisticated, and so I'm going to talk you through this. Like the tree hoppers, they feed on plant phlegm, and like them, they excrete a sugary honeydew, often tended by ants. Unlike the tree hoppers, they are capable of parthenogenic reproduction. So that's asexual female cloning, females making tiny replicas of themselves without any courtship or mating, or even eggs. So they're giving live birth. Their offspring are actually born reproductively mature. So they're already pregnant, highly skilled at making babies, making teenagers. So they're kind of skipping that whole early developmental stage. And you can see how a single aphid can really quickly grow to become a colony. They also exhibit pretty interesting wing polymorphism. So you've probably seen aphids with wings and aphids without wings. You may have assumed that aphids with wings are the reproductives, because that happens in some groups. But actually, the presence of wings in female aphids is environmentally determined, and these these females making clones of themselves can and do make winged clones. And whether or not they make winged clones depends on how much they themselves have been eating, how good and rich their environment is with food. So when an aphid is cloning herself in conditions that are really crowded and she's not eating that much herself, that's when she starts to make winged clones, and those winged clones are able to then fly away and find another host plant to feed on. So it actually makes a lot of sense. They do eventually in the growing season make males, and they do mate, and the result of sexual mating is eggs. So not one of these little nymphs all ready to go, but eggs that can overwinter. So they overwinter in the egg stage. And the genus I want to call particular attention to is the Aster aphids, sometimes known as the large daisy aphids. And we have about 70 species in North America. I see a lot of red ones. They're not always red. They're not tended by ants, so that's unusual. In this photo, you can see some, like I was talking about, some with wings, some without. Their sexual forms develop in the autumn, and the aphid overwinters in the egg stage. They complete their life cycle on one host, which is different than a lot of aphids that use multiple hosts. They're almost exclusive to the Asteraceae. I'm not going to read through this list, but I included it for all the botanists among us. You can read through this list and look at the species epithet and have a really good guess what these aphids are feeding on. The native thistles for the first one, yarrow for the second one, on and on. There's one exception to aster feeding in North America, and that is this one here at the bottom. Again, many of you can probably guess what it feeds on, but I'll tell you, jewelweed. So not related to asters at all, but we've got one feeding on jewelweed. This photo here was from an aster. And yeah, I have a few more photos of them. Even if you can't get behind the fact that aphids are amazing, I think we should all be able to appreciate the window that aphids give us into the world of parasitism and predation. This is looking at the underside of a cup plant leaf, and what's going on here? This red circle is showing a parasitoid wasp, and this, you can see she's dipping her ovipositor into the body of an aphid. This is pretty easy to do. At least I assume the aphids are really slow moving. There's a lot of them. Again, it's kind of like cows. They're kind of like cows. The larva of the wasp develops inside of the aphid without killing it right away. So kind of killing it slowly as the larva grows. Eventually the wasp larva pupates and emerges out of the host aphid. And you can see these yellow circles here are what we call aphid mummies. But they're aphids that have been parasitized by a wasp, and this is kind of the bloated golden shell left behind. All on the underside of cup plant leaf. This is the slide that I've used before just to highlight the multi-benefits of a single native plant. In this case, cup plant holding water, providing pollen and nectar for all kinds of late season bees and butterflies, providing stem nesting sites, feeding squirrels and birds and others. And I just added this photo of the aphids because there's a lot going on there. There's possibly more biodiversity attracted to the underside of the leaf than maybe anywhere else on the plant. Okay, so another group, this is the longhorn beetles or cerambycids. We have roughly 900 to 1,000 species in North America. They take their name from their well-developed, very long antennae, which are their main sensory organ, their olfactory. The larvae of most species feed on dead, dying, or decaying wood, but some can feed on living plant tissue. I'll talk you through an example, one of my favorite examples in a moment. They generally have a really specialized feeding relationship with their host plants. This locust spore on the top left feeds on black locust. Its range is actually expanding as the black locust expands in range across our country. The banded longhorn feeds on oak and hickory and a few other hardwoods. Okay, so my personal favorite longhorn beetle is this red milkweed longhorn. There's quite a few in this genus. The larvae all feed on the roots of milkweed, so Asclepias species. They really spend their whole life centered around this plant. So the adults rest, feed, mate on milkweed. The adults typically live about a month. The eggs are laid at the base of the root crown. The larvae, like I said, feed on the roots. They can feed on small roots. They can also bore into larger tap roots, similar to what we see with a lot of the other longhorn beetles in wood, making these tunnels. They pupate in the soil in a little chamber near the soil surface, near the base of the plant. They're kind of unique in being capable of sound production. So if you pick them up, they will squeak, and I think it's so endearing when insects do that. It's not intimidating at all, yet I feel like they're trying to be really scary. They also make a second purring sound that has been reported in at least some species, and is thought to be used in communication with each other. Okay, so another group, the grasshoppers, again, really familiar group, but I'm gonna hopefully go a little deeper than maybe you've gone before. The eggs are laid in soil. This photo here is showing a female dipping her. I should have started by saying they're herbivorous, plant feeding. That's probably obvious. Eggs are laid in soil. You can see the insect dipping her abdomen into soil to lay eggs. This photo was titled "An Expectant Mother," which I just love because that's exactly what she is. Probably took a great deal of care in selecting the place, the soil type, where she was going to lay these eggs. The nymphs molt 5 times before reaching an adult stage. They are often cryptic in coloration. You see a lot of green ones hanging out on plants. You see brown and gray ones on sandy beaches, and they're really good at blending in. They also do this thing, many of them do this thing where when they're disturbed, they jump. They've got these big, strong legs. They jump away, sometimes not even very far away. But in the act of jumping, they spread their wings and flash a bright color. And what that does, it does this for me, and I imagine for other predators, is you see this flash of red or orange, and you kind of memorize that flash and think, oh, I can find that. And then the grasshopper lands and closes up its wings and blends in with its surroundings so well that it's just a really effective way of getting away. They're also classic poikilotherms, so their activity is very regulated by temperature. This is common across insects, but are really easy to see in the grasshoppers. You can go out on a cool morning and just pick grasshoppers up off of plants. Later in the day, you can't get near them. They make noise by rubbing their hind legs against their wings. They also have ears to hear their own noises. In grasshoppers, the ears are on the abdomen. Some of their relatives, the katydids and crickets, have ears on the front legs. And yeah, I think that's about all I wanted to say. The noises that they make are used in establishing territory and communicating with each other. Maybe just sounding off about the day. I don't know. Oh, I do talk more about diet here. So they can be graminivorous. That's hard for me to say. Feeding on grasses. They can feed on forbs exclusively, or they can have a mixed diet on grasses and forbs. Some of them are oligophagous, so having highly specialized relationship with a narrow set of food plants. And these are the ones that are the most interesting to me. And I think from a restoration perspective, pretty interesting as well, because maybe the types of plants that we want to be really thoughtful about being sure to include. This one here on the top left feeds exclusively on prairie sages, and the photographer for this, and sorry, I'm not seeing his name on here either. I didn't even credit this. So Dr. Matthew Burst of in Nebraska took these pictures, and he told me that they not only blend in and really look like the sage, but they also smell like the sages, which is kind of amazing. Another specialist here is the lower one, which it feeds in this area, northern Wisconsin and Minnesota, on large leaf aster. Okay, so grasshoppers get a lot of attention as pests, yet only a small fraction are problematic to humans. And to give you a better sense of this, roughly 10 to 15 species of the 700 or so in North America are considered problematic pests. And at more of a state level, roughly 4 species of the 100 or so in Nebraska are considered pests. Grasshopper control programs typically involve widespread spraying of broad spectrum insecticides. So something that I guess I feel like might be off of our radar a little bit, but should be worrisome, because there's all these non-target impacts of broad spectrum insecticides being sprayed across hundreds of thousands of acres. Xerces, we're so fortunate at Xerces to have a staff person dedicated to working on this issue. You'll hear from her later today, Sharon. And if you want to also read more about our work on grasshoppers, I would point you to this Wings magazine, which covers some of our efforts in the rangeland areas of the West. I also wanted to point out this bulletin from an agricultural cooperative in Manitoba, and I think they get the messaging on this just right. So in short, what they're saying is farmers fear grasshoppers because, according to legend, they eat everything. There's a flip side to this, and farmers use it to their advantage. Can use it to their advantage. In the grand scheme of prairie ecology, everything eats grasshoppers. And I'm going to go back one slide because I missed a little bit of content on their ecological role. So their sheer abundance really calls attention to their critical ecological role. They're a vital food source to other trophic levels, from songbirds to game birds to spiders, robber flies, those apocata blister beetles that I talked about earlier, whose larvae only feed on grasshopper eggs. But they also play this interesting role in large-scale community disturbance that's not unlike that of grazing animals and grazing mammals. So stay tuned for the grazing talk tomorrow, because I think this will be covered and really interesting. Okay, that's about all I have on grasshoppers. Talk about ambush bugs next. So these are predators. I'm switching now to some predaceous insects. They're a little unusual because they are hemipteran, the true bugs, most of which feed on plants. But in this case, we've got some predatory hemipterans. Both the nymphs and adults take prey. They have piercing, sucking mouth parts. So they essentially stab their prey, ingest their prey with saliva that contains digestive enzymes, and then they suck out the contents. They're mostly sit and wait predators, rather than being active hunters. They're anthophilous, a nice word for something that feeds on or lives among flowers. Living on flowers, you can imagine they prey primarily on unsuspecting bees, beetles, hoverflies. The males actively search for females, so they're sit and wait when it comes to food, but not when it comes to courtship. That might sound familiar. Their courtship is very sophisticated and interesting. They have a lot of tactile behavior, stridulatory, like noise-making behavior, like you see in the grasshoppers. They have pre and post copulatory mate guarding, which I'm sure all of you have seen. You often don't just see one ambush bug, you see two hanging out together. You can see on the photo on the right, the female is much larger than the male. And he is, I don't know if they've mated yet or are going to mate, but he stays around to guard her from other potential suitors for, you know, quite a large part of the day. Here's a photo showing a female on the bottom, two males having some sort of standoff. Eggs are laid on vegetation. I also wanted to point out that the size difference between the males and females is a little bit helpful because it enables them to capture different size prey and decrease the resource competition between the sexes. Another thing that humans do some of too. One of the most interesting ambush bugs is the species here, and I'm just going to call attention to this really nice paper on looking closer at their phenotypic variability, and this is something you've probably noticed as well. So some of them, it just within one species, there are some morphs that are white or whitish and some that are yellow. And the species frequents both white and yellow flowers, but yellower bugs are found on yellow flowers and whiter bugs are found on whiter flowers. And matching increases the success of capturing prey. So that's not too surprising. But they also found that the pattern appears to be driven by a combination of plasticity and habitat choice. And I think that's also a lot like us. So we like to fit in, it benefits us to fit in, and we can do this both by choosing to frequent situations where we do fit in, and by changing ourselves slightly when needed. So they're able to change their body color to better fit in, but they're also hanging out in places where they already naturally fit in. I didn't make a separate slide for this, but I wanted to touch on the goldenrod crab spider as well, because this is one of the most amazing spiders in North America, one of the only spiders here to exhibit the same color change capability. And there's so many similarities between these ambush bugs and the crab spiders. They also have a yellow and a white morph. I'm not sure about the ambush bugs, but in the case of the spiders, the color change is not instantaneous. It can take from 1 to 20 some days to complete. Okay, another group, the jumping spiders. This is the largest family of spiders. They make up about 13% of our spiders. They don't make a web. Instead, they have excellent vision. Just look at those eyes. They have these 4 eyes that you're seeing in the front, and then they have an additional 4 eyes on the top of the head. They get their name from this really agile jumping behavior, both when hunting or when fleeing. And they're generalist predators, so not a whole lot of discriminating between their prey. The species I'm going to call out is doesn't have a common name, but the Spedificus claris. The female constructs a retreat and egg case near the top of plants. The males detect female size and age based on chemicals in their silk. They have really elaborate courtship. This is common across the jumping spiders. You can see fantastic videos online. There's some that look like peacocks. They dance. They exhibit really cautious touch. Mating in spiders is a pretty dangerous thing, because if a female's not into you, she can eat you. So you have to be really careful. Yeah, they've also gotten some attention as a promising biocontrol agent. They take a range of prey. They can learn to recognize particular prey. They can detect prey from a pretty great distance. They prefer to stay in the same nest. So if you've got a greenhouse and you want a natural predator to manage plant bugs on your basil or tomatoes, you need something that's going to stay in your greenhouse and not be running out into the fields. So they're pretty, they hunker down, and they can be reared. Another group are the lacewings. Fairly familiar, beautiful group of insects. The larvae prey on aphids. Some of the larvae disguise themselves with different materials, ants, aphid mummies, which can help them blend right in with the aphids they're trying to eat. This lower left photo is showing them disguised in something. I'm actually not sure what. The eggs are laid on stalks, and these are really common to see. The explanation, at least from our perspective of the stalks, is related to the stalk helping the eggs and the hatching larvae avoid predation, both from predators wandering around on the stem, and also from siblings. So when these little eggs hatch into larvae, the larvae have to crawl down the stalk and find prey. So they're likely to just walk along the stalk and find appropriate prey, rather than if they hatched in an egg mass, they'd be pretty likely to just start eating their siblings. So there's an example of a mother looking out for sibling rivalry. And yeah, they overwinter as adults. They're really often associated with aphids. You can even see these eggs were laid next to a big mass of aphids. We've got brown lacewings too, pretty similar life history. Oh, yeah, and I think, sorry, I didn't, some of the text on this is wrong because I just copied and pasted. These ones don't exhibit the larval disguises. And yeah, also pretty common and beautiful. Lady beetles, another more familiar group. Larvae and adults prey on aphids. The individuals consume as many as 5,000 aphids in their short lifetime. You'll notice that the value of insect predators is often measured by humans in terms of the number of aphids that they can consume. So a little bit more of our anti-aphid sentiment coming through. What I mostly wanted to talk about with lady beetles, they get a lot of attention, but I included them largely because of their conservation concerns. So kind of like bumblebees, we have a pretty good record of their historical range and abundance across North America. And species composition is changing. So over the past 20 years, native ladybugs that were once very common have become extremely rare. During the same time, beetles from other parts of the world have greatly increased, both in numbers and range. This is happening very quickly. We don't know how this is going to impact our long-term ladybug diversity or the ecological roles that they fill. And just to illustrate this, so the 9-spotted lady beetle is an example of one that was once very common, wide-ranging across most of the US and Canada. It's in 1930, this author wrote that this is the commonest species of the genus Coccinella in the state. It's usually abundant wherever aphids are present. It's usually especially common on field crops and grass and must be rated among those species of greatest economic benefit. Okay, this is from Minnesota. Fast forward, the species experienced widespread decline in the 80s. And then just this year, an update from wildlife biologist Chris Smith, who told me fewer than 10 confirmed sightings in Minnesota have been made in the last decade. And all of them have been from the Anoka sandplain subsection, that's actually the part of Minnesota where I grew up, and it's increasingly threatened by suburban development and agriculture and just a lot of habitat loss. So you can get involved, record the lady beetles that you see on lostladybug.org. Okay, another group, ground beetles. I'm highlighting them not because they don't get a lot of attention, I think they do, but mainly because they're such an important group in conservation biocontrol on farms. And a lot of the work that we do on small farms in the Midwest, we kind of do in the name of these ground beetles. I'm not going to read through all of these bullets for sake of time, but I will show you this photo showing an insectary strip or a beetle bank on an organic vegetable farm in Minnesota. And yeah, I mean, what we're trying to do here is attract beetles, which are important predators in these crop fields. Also, they eat weed seeds, so they're helpful for managing the weed seed bank in crop fields. And we're putting this habitat in really close proximity to the crops to increase the chances of these services actually happening in the crop fields themselves. And these strips obviously don't just support ground beetles, they're supportive of pollinators and all kinds of beneficial insects that farmers want to have around. Lori, how am I doing on time? I'm not exactly sure when we got started.
You've got a couple more minutes, Sarah.
Okay, I'm going to do what I can with a few fungivores. Starting with staphylinids. These are insects that eat just about everything, with the exception of living plant tissue, although somebody did recently find one that eats living plant tissue. And they've got all these unique ecological roles as a result of their unique diets. My main point here is that this is a hyper diverse group of animals. We have over 63,000 species. It's considered the largest extant family of organisms. So most of our insects are beetles. You all know that. And most of our beetles are staphylinids. They're an ancient group. We have fossils from the Triassic over 200 million years ago. Lots of fossils showing this structure on the mouth parts. It's called a spore brush, used to gather fungal spores, which is really telling us a lot about the history of fungi on our planet, which don't fossilize, and we don't know as much about. Another beetle is this forked fungus beetle. And this beetle spends its entire life on Ganoderma mushrooms. It finds its mate on these mushrooms, larvae feed on the mushrooms. What else? Adults feed on the mushrooms. They exhibit some really interesting courtship behavior that I'm not going to go into, but if you want to look into it, there's a paper, 1956 paper detailing the life history of this fantastic beetle. I think I'll skip through this one as well. Maybe I'll just tell you that. So I collect a lot of mushrooms and brought home a jar of turkey tail mushrooms for just to have over the winter. Went in the cupboard and found it had turned entirely into a pile of beetles and beetle frass. Turns out it's a cis beetle, and these are beetles that can exhibit, can exhibit parthenogenic reproduction, just like those aphids that we talked about earlier. Pretty unusual for a beetle, and a really nice strategy. This author in the 60s actually described it as a strategy for dealing with habitat fragmentation in the highly fragmented agricultural regions of the Midwest. So this was in the 60s, and they thought it was fragmented here and driving parthenogenic behavior in beetles who might not be able to find a mate, but can reproduce on their own.
Sarah, do you want to kind of finish up, and then we have a lot of questions for you.
Okay, fungus, this was my last one. So this is a moth that feeds not on plant tissue, like most moths, but on fungus. Again, something we might have a lot in common with if you're like me and love chicken of the woods. And the rest of this is just resources. We have a lot of resources on the Xerces website. If you are looking for more of this stuff, just reach out. And I will, resources, sorry, everyone. I'm just gonna get to my acknowledgement slide. Thank you, Lori and PFA and all of our members and supporters. And I can take a few questions.
So I've never thought of bugs as sexy before, but I guess I have to start thinking that way now.
There you go. Yeah, a lot of what we know about insects is their diet and their mating behavior. And then, less interesting things like number of generations per year, and hence my focus. And the diet is really important because it's one thing, I didn't say this, but it's one thing that we as practitioners have a lot of control over. We can manage plants a lot easier than we can manage insects.